Our story begins with a boy whose stomach is a bottomless pit, so his parents opened a crematorium just for him. You see, this profession has an unwritten rule. The demon beasts brought here always have a bit of residual energy left behind. Decades ago, the world was suddenly invaded by countless demon beasts, and humanity paid a price in blood to survive. They eventually learned to grow stronger by consuming demon blood and cores, but the leftover carcasses remained a problem. Whether raw or cooked, anyone who ate the meat ended up dead, no exceptions, yet thousands of beasts are slain every year. If these carcasses aren't handled quickly, they become sources of pollution, which is exactly why demon crematoriums were created. As Jiang Chun grew older, however, the tiny bits of residual blood were no longer enough to keep his hunger at bay. Driven to the brink of starvation, he helped his father, Jiang Wanli, move a massive carcass while asking a simple question. Dad, I'm so hungry. I really want to take a bite of that meat. Upon hearing this, Wanli's expression immediately shifted. Listen to me, kid. How many times have I told you? Demon beasts are not for eating. They are absolutely not for eating. If you keep eyeing that meat, I'll break your legs right here and now. Chun looked on with regret, thinking it was such a waste of good meat that could surely satisfy his hunger. Hearing his son's mutterings, Wanli knew the boy was acting up again and decided it was time for a serious lesson. He pointed to the large characters on the wall and shouted for Chun to read them aloud, one by one. Demon beasts are not edible. Those who eat them will have their eyes turn red and transform into sources of pollution. Chun looked toward where his father was pointing, but he was so drowsy he could barely make out the words on the wall. His nonsensical response momentarily enraged his father, but seeing the boy's innocent eyes, Wanli's anger quickly vanished. Deep down, he felt a pang of guilt. His son had never once felt full since the day he was born. It's not that you don't want to eat, it's that I've failed you. But this meat is truly poison. I'll go check on dinner. Handle these few carcasses yourself for now, Wanli said, his figure gradually disappearing as he walked away. Left alone with the demon beast carcasses, Chun couldn't help but swallow hard as he eyed the textured skin of an iron-tail eagle. It looked to be at least a third-tier beast, and as he reluctantly dragged it toward the incinerator, something strange happened. A sudden, searing heat in his pocket forced him to stop, and in an instant, a mysterious book soared into the air. He wondered how the simple picture book he'd bought for a friend had transformed like this, but he had no time to react. A bright flash blinded him, and when he finally opened his eyes, the golden book had vanished directly into his mind. He instinctively shook his head, only to see massive golden characters floating before his eyes, a sight that left him utterly stunned. He wondered if the heavens had finally taken pity on his empty stomach, though he wasn't quite sure what this treasure actually was. After a moment of silent contemplation, he steeled his resolve, telling himself that wealth and fate were in the hands of the gods. He was willing to die in battle, but he refused to die of hunger, and just then, his parents came rushing back toward him. His mother, Yao Jing, shouted anxiously that they had to leave for a while because his great-uncle in the next city was fading fast. Chun, who had been busy looking for an excuse to finally taste the demon meat, blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "That's a great death," he exclaimed, causing the air to turn cold as his mother's expression darkened instantly. She asked him exactly what he meant by that, and realizing his blunder, Chun scrambled to come up with a desperate excuse. He claimed he meant it was too early, wondering aloud why his great-uncle had to pass away at such a tender age. 80 is the prime of life for an adventurer. After all, Yao Jing simply snorted and told him to stay home and behave. She had already called his school to request a leave of absence, instructing him on what to do while they were away. If anyone brought in demon beasts, he was to follow the standard procedure, a prospect that secretly made Chun jump for joy. Since he could barely feed himself, he had never been able to keep up with the cultivation lessons at his school anyway. As the future manager of a crematorium, he felt his chances for higher education had been dead on arrival the moment he started. Suppressing his excitement, he wished them a safe trip while his father, Wanli, watched him with a lingering sense of concern. Seeing his son's seemingly sensible expression, Wanli sighed and mentioned he'd left some money in the cabinet in case the hunger became unbearable. He suggested Chun buy a bottle of demon beast essence blood and stop upsetting his mother. Chun quickly promised he understood. An hour after his parents departed, we see Chun heading to a traditional medicine shop to gather ingredients for cooking the iron-tail eagle. He teased the shopkeeper, Uncle John, about the declining quality of his stock, even jokingly threatening to report him for selling fakes. Old John laughed it off, claiming fake herbs were easier to sell anyway, and they shared a bit of idle banter for a moment. Chun handed over his shopping list, which Old John skimmed through, noting that the items were mostly inexpensive trifles. He told Chun to grab the herbs himself. After settling the bill, the young man began his hurried journey back home. On the way, however, a familiar figure appeared, causing Chun's entire body to tense up in an instant. "Little bottle, get over here," the voice boomed, using the nickname Chun had earned back at school. Since childhood, he had required demon beast essence blood just to survive, but the cost was often far beyond his family's modest means. During his school days, he frequently had to lick the remnants from the essence bottles provided by the school to the students. Most of his classmates looked down on the tiny drops left at the bottom of those bottles, but for Chun, they were a necessity. Over time, Little Bottle and Brother Bottle became the mocking titles they used to tease him, a bit cruel, to be honest. Snapping back to the present, he turned and offered a flattering smile, greeting the man as his beloved principal. The principal wasn't buying the act, stating he had come specifically to find Chun and deliver a stern warning. He told the boy to stop using Lon Lon to get free food and drinks, complaining that his own reputation was suffering because of it. For the next 5 minutes, the principal's mouth didn't stop for a single second as he launched into a relentless, heated lecture. The Lon Lon he referred to was Dongfang Lon, a girl who transferred to his school after her father died fighting demon beasts. It was common knowledge that Chun and Dongfang Lon were childhood friends, but as time passed, their paths began to diverge. As Chin's appetite grew larger, Dongfang Lon became more outstanding, attracting a growing crowd of admirers, and that's where he stepped in. He had made a decision that went entirely against Lanlin's wishes. Anyone who wanted him to leave her alone had to pay up, starting at 5 bottles of essence blood. By the time he finished reminiscing, we see that he had managed to collect several hundred bottles of demon beast essence blood through this little scheme. The principal's daily lecture was finally drawing to a close, and seeing Chin's usual unbothered expression, he couldn't help but sigh in frustration. He added a final warning, telling Chin to stay away from a student named Li Muzi, as the boy came from a very powerful background. The principal warned him to be careful or Li would settle the score. Then, surprisingly, he handed Chin a few more bottles of essence blood. He muttered that he didn't know how Chin's stomach worked, noting that even his own grandson hadn't consumed as much as this boy had. The principal grumbled that Chin seemed able to eat anything and everything before turning on his heel and walking away, still swearing under his breath. We return to the incineration room, where Chin hurriedly set up an iron pot and began chopping the iron-tail eagle into small pieces. He tossed the meat into the pot and let it slow cook for over half an hour until a mouth-watering aroma began to fill the entire air. As time passed, he found the delicious scent harder and harder to resist, until finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. The moment he tasted a piece of the dried mushroom, the words "absolutely delicious" seemed to explode inside his mind, which is quite the reaction. At the same time, as the mushroom went down, he realized he was experiencing a sensation very similar to drinking demon beast essence blood. Even though the feeling wasn't incredibly intense, he could still clearly sense the energy flowing through him, much to his surprise. So, he decided to eat his fill without a care. If he was going to die, he figured he might as well die with a full stomach. Besides, he told himself that without him as a burden, his parents could always just start over and have another child. A dark thought, perhaps. With that in mind, he began to eat even more recklessly, and within just half an hour, he had even sucked the marrow from the bones 5 times over. For the first time in all these years, he finally understood what it felt like to be truly satisfied and completely full. He wondered what all those years of hunger and sacrifice had even been for, but as he was reflecting on his first full meal, things changed. Suddenly, a slight discomfort stirred in his stomach, and immediately after, every cell in his body became abnormally active and alive. Before he could even begin to wonder why, a sudden surge of energy began to rush through his limbs and his entire being. He wondered if this was the frustration he'd felt at school boiling over. For years, he had been so hungry his stomach practically touched his spine. Back then, he couldn't muster a single spark of energy to become a cultivator, but now that he was full, his power was suddenly awakening. He realized his body had simply never been satisfied before, and while he felt a surge of joy, he noticed his transformation wasn't over yet. A golden light suddenly flickered before his eyes, and immediately after, a complex energy circulation map appeared within his mind. He was utterly incredulous, as common knowledge dictated that one could only obtain skills by consuming expensive demon pills. How could eating a mere carcass grant him this? Without time to overthink, he quickly began guiding the energy through his limbs and core. Following the cultivation methods taught at school, he spent half an hour circulating the breath until a feeling of pure refreshment washed over him. Opening his eyes with a start, he realized he had finally reached the first level of cultivation, a milestone he thought might never come. We move forward to the next day at 2 o'clock, when the transport truck carrying demon beast carcasses arrived right on schedule. The driver called out for Jiang Wanli to come and receive the delivery, but as we know, the boy's father wasn't there. Chen hurried to the door and explained that Uncle Nyo's timing was off, as his parents were away attending a funeral. Uncle Nyo suggested taking the carcasses to another crematorium instead, but Chen quickly protested, not wanting to lose the opportunity. He insisted that after years of practicing with his father, he knew exactly how to handle the incineration process himself. He just needed help getting them inside, though Uncle Nyo doubted if he could handle an 8th-level Howling Moon dog killed just last night. The man asked if he was truly up for it, and after Chun gave his word, Uncle Nyo told the boy to be careful. After finishing his instructions, Uncle Nyo ordered the young men behind him to begin the processing. Then, seeing that no one was watching, he leaned in and whispered to Ping, explaining that these demon carcasses had been killed by the authorities by mistake. Because of that, the extraction of their essence blood hadn't been very thorough. Ping nodded, thanking him for the quiet tip-off. Uncle Nyo smiled at the boy's reaction, but his expression soon turned serious. He warned him that the city district hadn't been very peaceful lately. Demon beasts were occasionally slipping past the perimeter. His advice was simple: don't wander around at night. Ping promised he wouldn't. Uncle Nyo added that inspectors would arrive in 3 days, warning the boy not to slack off during that time. Shin assured him the pollution deadline wouldn't be an issue, promising everything would be processed within 3 days. After that, we see Uncle Nyo and his men finally depart. Shin looks at the 8th level Howling Moon Dog, and his mouth begins to water uncontrollably. The moment he approaches the beast, the golden book within his mind, not a yellow one, mind you, flips to a brand new page. It describes the 8th level Howling Moon Dog as a minor demon with tough meat and many bones, though eating it supplements one's energy. The flavor is mediocre, but it suggests stewing the bones and using a bit of chili to create a flavorful base for the meat. By slicing the meat thin and pairing it with a special honey-based dipping sauce, the taste can be significantly improved. The recipe for this sauce not only boosts strength slightly, but also offers a minor enhancement to kidney function. It even increases the feeling of fullness, though the book's final comment, that dogs won't even eat it, is strategically ignored by Chun. He tells himself the book is just being picky. Even an 8th level beast isn't good enough for its refined tastes. Hot pot it is. He recalls hearing that in the old, harmonious society, people were afraid to eat dog meat for fear of being attacked by activists. He feels quite lucky not to live in that era. The idea of being criticized just for eating meat seems truly terrifying to him. After placing the carcass on the steel rack, he feels his stomach growling again and immediately sets a pot of water to boil. The aroma of the cooking meat soon fills the air, bringing him immense satisfaction as he spends the day devouring the remains. By the time the last iron-tailed eagle is finished, the whole world seems brighter. He pauses to feel the changes within his body. He gasps in shock as he senses his internal energy. He has already reached the 2nd level after eating only 3 birds. What shocks him most is the change in his sharp claw technique, which previously could only leave faint marks on pebbles. Now, his fingers can pierce stone as easily as tofu, meaning his mastery has reached at least the small success stage. According to the books, an ordinary person would need to consume 10 demon pills and practice diligently to reach this level. Yet he achieved it simply by eating 3 iron-tailed eagles. At this moment, he realizes his life has changed forever. Shin feels his future is looking incredibly bright. For 7 straight days, his life follows this same rhythm, peaceful and content. To him, being full is the ultimate happiness. With his parents still away, the level of demon carcasses he consumes begins to steadily rise. His cultivation improves alongside his diet, reaching a terrifying 7th level in just 1 week. To be honest, that is a staggering pace. His sharp claw technique has reached the grand success stage, far exceeding the level of any ordinary practitioner. At this stage, his skills can now inflict serious damage on beasts near the proximity rank, even though his own cultivation hasn't quite stepped into that realm yet. One night, after finishing his usual demon meal, he is deep in cultivation when he suddenly hears a movement at the main gate. He frowns, wondering who would visit at such an hour. It is exactly midnight as he heads to the living room and opens a cabinet. He pulls out a steel blade, his father's prized possession. Ordinary people don't visit crematoriums this late, so he puts on his shoes, wary. As he watches the door, his nose twitches. He takes a deep breath, and his expression shifts instantly. A demon beast inside the city walls. This is highly unusual. Even in the suburbs, the sudden appearance of a demon within the walls is, well, suspicious to say the least. Recalling Uncle Nyo's warnings from a few days ago, a realization dawns on him. Could there be a spatial rift near the crematorium? The thought alone sends a chill down his spine. The 13 cities maintain strict control over spatial rifts, especially wild, unregistered ones. He catches a scent from outside. There is one beast, with a cultivation level roughly around the 5th rank. This is a new gift, derived from eating the Howling Moon Dog. His grand success sense of smell can detect danger within 100 meters and even estimate power. His eyes flicker with uncertainty. Deep down, he is torn between reporting this to the city defense team or taking matters into his own hands. In the past, his first instinct would have been to call for help, but now he hesitates. After all, he is no longer defenseless. A certain restlessness stirs within him, a killer instinct born of his new strength. He is, after all, a 7th rank master of the sharp claw. He wonders if he should take the risk. If he succeeds, the rewards could be immense. The proximity rank is almost within his reach. He makes his decision. Who would ever complain about becoming too strong? He decides to test his skills on the beast waiting outside. Gripping the steel blade, he flings the door open. However, the moment he sees the beast, he immediately reconsiders his plan. He had intended to use the steel blade, but the enemy before him was a rat, a massive creature no smaller than Chin himself. It bared tusks as savage as a wild boar's, its eyes glowing crimson with rage as saliva dripped visibly from its jaws. The beast was clearly starving, but Chin simply took a deep breath and beckoned the rat forward with a smirk. He taunted it to come closer, and whether provoked or simply driven by hunger, the rat lunged through the air at him. He stared it down, remembering the lesson that when facing a demon beast, one must never show fear. One must be even more ferocious. To be honest, his cultivation level already suppressed the beasts, and as it leaped, a golden light flashed in his eyes. Seizing the moment, he channeled his energy into his sharp claw, shifting his weight and swinging his right hand with immense force. With a single swift movement, the rat fell into convulsions, revealing 5 deep finger holes pierced right through its spine. He burst into laughter, mocking the lowly rodent for daring to challenge someone as formidable as Jiang Ping. It was a moment of pure youthful arrogance, but immediately after, his legs went weak. He had used far too much strength. It took a full minute to recover before he could drag the carcass into the cremation room to begin the dissection. As expected, a green core the size of a mung bean appeared, though it carried a rather foul, pungent odor. He had no desire to eat this one, so he dropped it into a bottle to save for paying off his debts later. After filling several spare bottles with essence blood, he finally tossed the remains into the incinerator and ignited the flames. He added a few more shovels of fuel, closed the door, and headed back out to search for the spatial rift. Along the way, he encountered several more ground-plucking rats, using each one to refine his mastery over the sharp claw technique. None of these rats exceeded the 6th level of cultivation, which, naturally, made him feel quite optimistic about the situation. The level of beasts emerging from a rift indicates its danger. Since these were only mid-tier, the rift likely peaked at the 9th level. We know that these rifts often lead to fragmented realms, shards of ancient continents, hidden lakes, or even lost oceans. While the beasts here were weak, the treasures were not. Many have risen to greatness by finding high-level artifacts in low-level rifts. This felt even more exhilarating than winning the lottery as Jiang Ping sped along, discovering a shimmering rift less than a kilometer from home. The fissure glowed with a fluorescent light, looking very much like a vertical eye, and without a moment's hesitation, he charged right in. As soon as he entered, the rift's light abruptly dimmed. Meanwhile, the South City Guard's alarms began to blare across the district. An energy fluctuation had been detected in the suburbs, and nearby squads were ordered to handle it immediately, though it seemed a minor matter. Since the energy level was low, the veterans continued their high-level hunts while a rookie squad was dispatched to provide support. After a flash of blinding light, Jiang Ping felt solid ground beneath his feet again and opened his eyes to survey his new surroundings. The steel blade on his back shimmered in the gloom of the rift, where 2 deep, narrow paths split off to the left and right. On the surface, both paths looked identical, dense, overgrown jungles, but he sensed a hidden danger and gave the air a quick sniff. To the left, he smelled at least a dozen ground-plucking rats of the 5th level or higher. To the right, there were only 7 or 8. The choice of which path to take was obvious, and in that moment, he felt incredibly grateful for the sense of smell he'd gained from the dog meat. Without that gift, he wouldn't have known how to choose. He stepped onto the right path, where 7 or 8 rats immediately charged him. Their eyes glowed red with fury, but he didn't panic at all. His recent training meant he was no longer a rookie who feared a fight. He knew exactly how to strike, using his palms like blades as he shifted his body to dodge and launch a fierce counterattack. The rats couldn't last a single round, and within seconds, they were all on the ground with 5 distinct finger holes pierced through their skulls. He couldn't help but feel he was being a bit of a bully. At the 7th level with a mastered claw technique, this was a total slaughter. Mastering such a skill usually requires years of discipline, yet he had achieved it simply by eating, which is quite the shortcut, to be honest. Even more absurd was his mastered sense of smell, allowing him to anticipate every move before the rats could even think of an ambush. It really did feel like bullying, didn't it? He straightened up and continued walking for 20 minutes until the narrow path finally opened up. The sight before him made him pause and knit his brows in confusion. It was a temple, though a careful sniff revealed no immediate danger. He wondered how a peaceful temple bathed in Buddha's light could exist here, just as the distant, hollow sound of a bell echoed through the air. From the temple gates, a young novice monk emerged, wearing magnificent robes and approaching Jiang Ping with a wide, beaming smile. The monk greeted him warmly, noting that this was the first time a visitor had arrived since the rift opened. Jiang Ping was completely baffled. He had expected to be fighting monsters, yet here he was being greeted like an honored guest. He truly couldn't smell any danger coming from the monk, so he decided to play along, explaining that he had simply stumbled upon this place. When he asked how they knew he was coming, the monk explained that Mount Thousand Buddhas was protected by a formation that detected his arrival. The monk lamented that monsters had been rampaging outside their gates for days, leaving them trapped and helpless until Jiang Ping appeared. Jiang Ping found this a bit hard to believe. If the mountain was so powerful, he wondered why they couldn't just clear the monsters themselves. He also had a nagging question. If their defensive formation was so strong, how could they possibly be trapped inside by mere beasts? At this point, we see him struggling to figure out what kind of being this monk actually was, as the novice explained the formation was failing. The monk claimed they could only barely protect the temple grounds and invited him inside. Jiang Ping gave a cautious nod. Since he had already come this far, he wasn't about to back down now, but the moment he stepped through the gates, his brow furrowed. He was hit by a sudden, overwhelming scent of blood, a smell so thick it couldn't hide from his mastered sense of smell. In the courtyard, a group of young men in monk robes sat on meditation mats, their presence seemingly peaceful at first glance. They were chanting sutras with great devotion, yet Jiang Ping remained on high alert because that metallic scent of blood was coming from them. The novice, whose name was Liao Chun, made a polite gesture for him to follow, flashing a smile that revealed his bright white teeth. Jiang Ping was nearly startled to death. The dim light outside had hidden the details, but now that they were inside, the truth was visible. As Liao Chen smiled, Jiang Ping spotted bits of raw meat stuck in his teeth, accompanied by a heavy, sickening stench of fresh blood. He kept his head down as he followed, and before long, he was led to a quiet meditation room where Liao Chen spoke with a grin. The novice explained that the abbot considered any visitor a guest, especially one who could reach the mountain during such difficult times. He told Jiang Ping to settle in until the abbot could meet him, then added that as a man of the secular world, he must enjoy eating. He claimed a wild chicken had conveniently wandered into the temple and died last night, so they were making soup for their guest. Jiang Ping immediately grew alert, sensing something was very wrong. A monk with meat in his teeth was more than a simple broken vow. The real question was where the meat came from, especially since Liao Chun claimed the outside was crawling with monsters. A dark thought flashed through his mind. They were eating the monsters, so he forced himself to stay calm while sitting on the mat. Before long, Liao Chun returned with a steaming, fragrant bowl of meat, smiling as he urged his guest to eat while it was hot. The monk insisted that since they were men of the cloth, the entire pot was for him, as guests were rare on Mount Thousand Buddhas. As he stared at the bowl, Jiang Ping's heart nearly hammered out of his chest. He realized these monks were trying to trap him. This wasn't chicken at all. It was clearly iron-tailed eagle meat, a substance he knew all too well would turn a man into a monster. If he ate this, he would become a corrupted being within 3 days, and suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. These monks were actually consuming the monsters. They were insane, and if they lost control, they would become living disasters. Seeing that Jiang Ping hadn't moved, Liao Chen watched him intently and asked in a low, slow voice why he wasn't eating. He wondered if the food wasn't to his liking, and though his smile looked twisted now, Jiang Ping didn't dare show his fear. He forced a laugh, telling the monk it wasn't the taste, but rather that the cooking method was all wrong. Liao Chen's face stiffened as he asked what he meant, and the air grew cold. This monk was at least at the 9th heaven realm. Suppressing his terror, Jiang Ping pointed out that monks wouldn't know how to cook meat properly and offered to show them his skills. He took the soup and walked out. The monk stood frozen in surprise as the dangerous aura slowly began to dissipate. Liao Chun agreed to see his craftsmanship, and soon they were in the kitchen where a pot of iron-tailed eagle was boiling away. Jiang Ping cursed his luck internally, then politely asked Master Liao Chun to step outside so he could prepare his secret recipe. The monk smiled and left, and once the door was shut, Jiang Ping pulled out his medicinal herbs to recook the tainted meat. He had a few tricks up his sleeve, and as a delicious aroma began to waft out, he opened the door to test Master Liao Chun. Jiang Ping offered the monk a bite, but Liao Chen declined, insisting that men of the cloth cannot eat meat and urging his guest to enjoy it alone. And so, acting as if he were famished, he began to eat heartily right under the monk's watchful eye. Half an hour later, the meal was finished. The entire iron-tailed eagle, soup and bone alike, had vanished into his stomach, leaving Liao Chun with a satisfied smile as he escorted him back. Early the next morning, we see Jiang Ping open his door only to find Liao Chen standing there, holding yet another iron-tailed eagle in his hand. With a beaming face, the monk remarked on the incredible luck that another wild chicken had fallen dead in the temple, surely a sign of the guest's good fortune. Jiang Ping's pupils contracted. An iron-tailed eagle falling to its death was an absurdity, but he simply forced a smile and called it a lucky coincidence. He suggested following the old routine of cooking it himself, and though Liao Chun nodded with a smile, that expression sent a cold shiver down his spine. Soon, the sound of meat being chopped echoed from the kitchen, and as the monks chanted their sutras, they all wore those same unsettling smiles. It seemed the heavens decreed he must eat the processed iron-tailed eagle once again, a task he performed with a heavy heart. This third-tier monster didn't offer much cultivation, and feeling the temple's growing strangeness, he decided it was time to leave, or so he hoped. But before he could speak, Liao Chen arrived with an unquestionable tone, announcing that the abbot was finally free and wished to see the handsome young guest. Jiang Ping swallowed his excuses and forced a smile, realizing he had no choice but to follow the monk's lead. He claimed to have long admired Buddhist teachings, all while noting that these monks were at the 7th or 8th heaven realm, far too strong to fight. We see him realize a vital rule. As long as he didn't cross their boundaries, he might remain safe for the time being. Refusing the monster meat, for instance, was a path to certain death. He had noticed how Liao Chen's eyes changed whenever he hesitated. He recalled lessons about spatial rifts. Some were alien worlds, others fragments, and some were scenes trapped in an infinite loop. This place felt like the latter, a haunting cycle where these monks might be nothing more than ancient souls or projections of time. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, he finally knocked on the door of the meditation room, hoping for answers. The sound of bathing stopped, and an old monk with snow-white hair and a frail frame looked at him with a gentle, knowing smile. The abbot asked if he was the young man who had arrived the previous night, and Jiang Ping nodded, trying his best to appear calm. The abbot gestured for him to sit, but as the old man spoke, Jiang Ping's pupils contracted. He noticed bits of meat still stuck between the monk's teeth. It seemed the entire Thousand Buddha Mountain was a facade. A thick scent of blood hit his nose, and he had to fight the urge to gag. When asked how he found the mountain, Jiang Ping forced a perfect, eight-toothed smile and replied that everything was wonderful. He praised the food and the beautiful scenery, remarking that compared to the monster-infested world outside, this place was surely a paradise. A flicker of surprise crossed the abbot's eyes at the mention of a paradise, and he let out a soft, dry chuckle at the description. Since he found it so pleasant, the abbot suggested that perhaps our young guest should simply stay here on Thousand Buddha Mountain forever. He boasted that while the temple had declined, their ancient heritage remained deep and their secret techniques were beyond count. When asked which technique he wished to learn, Jiang Ping's eyes nearly popped out. The real performance was finally beginning. He remembered from his textbooks that these rifts often played out like this, with these entities using lures to trap the unwary. He reasoned that if they were truly so powerful, they wouldn't have been wiped out by monsters only to repeat this cycle forever. These people might be alive, or they might be long dead. It was impossible to tell, but to defeat the old monk, he needed a plan. After a moment's thought, he agreed to stay, realizing this location could be the key to fixing the rift's coordinates. Whether he reported the find or kept it for himself, it was a fortune. However, he claimed he couldn't commit quite so easily. He suggested that if the abbot allowed him to visit the library pavilion to learn the temple's history, he might feel more at home. The old monk was completely stunned. In all these years, this was the very first guest to ever make such a peculiar request. Usually, people either refused and were beaten to death, or their eyes lit up with greed at the mention of secret techniques. But this was the first time someone wanted to evaluate the temple first, and for a moment, the abbot's mind simply couldn't process it. Jiang Ping continued to watch the monk's expression closely, and seeing he hadn't crossed a line yet, he spoke even more freely. He casually mentioned that mutual selection was the modern way of doing things, and after a long silence, the abbot slowly nodded. The old monk finally agreed, repeating that it was acceptable, and so, the next phase of the game began. The abbot, having finally made up his mind to keep him, nodded instinctively and told Liao Chen to lead the way. The old monk clearly needed time to process what was happening, while Jiang Ping secretly laughed at how easily he'd been fooled. To be honest, the abbot's intellect seemed lacking. He was desperately hypocritical, clinging to his pretenses even in this monstrous state. Jiang Ping knew that if the monk didn't consume him now, Liao Chen would likely be the one to strike first. He could handle Liao Chen, but there was no need. The temple's invitation was clearly a trap designed to ensnare him. At this moment, many things became clear. Joining them likely meant becoming one of those mindless chanting monks in the courtyard. He suspected this was how Thousand Buddha Mountain saved people. You get the benefits, but there is a dark paradox involved. Once you join, the price of leaving is immense, so Jiang Ping played it smart. He would join, but only after an evaluation. It was a perfectly reasonable request, and soon, we see him following Liao Chen toward a small three-story building. Liao Chen explained that this was where the secret techniques were kept, his tone much friendlier now that he considered Jiang Ping one of them. He laid out the first rule. Only one technique could be chosen from the third floor, and greed was strictly forbidden. Jiang Ping nodded as the second rule was given. He had to be out within 4 hours, and then the heavy doors swung open. Inside, we see shelves lined with scrolls. It was surprising that Thousand Buddha Mountain possessed so many techniques. In truth, he didn't care about these ultimate arts. The guidance techniques from his school were far superior to anything in this rift. Even a secret technique was useless to him, as the modern path focused on the much more efficient method of consuming monster cores. It was the simplest and strongest way to gain skills directly, whereas these ancient manuals required years of tedious study. A monster core grants power instantly, and more importantly, the modern inheritance was orderly and well documented. He wasn't crazy enough to abandon a proven path for some ghostly technique that might backfire with no one to help him. He knew all this because he'd been a diligent student, especially fond of reading the Cultivator Chronicles filled with strange tales. He recalled stories of geniuses entering rifts, finding peerless techniques, and rising from the bottom to the top of the national exams. They were the darlings of heaven, basking in glory and proving everyone wrong, until they reached university and had to choose a mentor. Suddenly, they were stuck. No one would take them because they didn't follow the standard path, leaving them to struggle alone while others soared. This cautionary tale is still used today on the 13th floor to warn young students not to get ahead of themselves. Deep down, Jiang Ping knew he wasn't smarter than everyone else, so his interest in the third floor techniques was merely a pretense to stall for time. He opened a scroll and began to read. The first floor was mostly filled with strange anecdotes and curiosities. This was exactly the kind of thing he loved, and after about 2 hours of reading, his nose suddenly twitched at a peculiar scent. It was an incredibly sweet fragrance that others might miss, but Jiang Ping possessed the heightened sense of smell he'd inherited from Xiaoyu. The scent was faint yet utterly irresistible, and as he put down his book to investigate, something very strange began to happen. His body began to move mechanically, like a walking corpse, and he felt a surge of pure terror at the loss of control. He fought desperately to regain command of his limbs, but he could only watch as his own hand reached out toward a bookshelf and pressed a candlestick. He wondered if he was losing his mind, but then a soft click echoed through the room, revealing a hidden set of stairs. The passage was deep and dark, leading to a secret chamber below. Grabbing a candle, he felt his legs carry him down against his will. His mind screamed in protest, but his body wouldn't listen, and after walking for what felt like forever, the path behind him vanished with a heavy creak. Suddenly, he regained control of his body and looked around in a panic, shouting out to see who was pulling the strings. Only the sound of the wind answered him, swirling like a fine mist, which, to be honest, was not a very comforting response. Then, a voice rang out, a woman's voice, incredibly charming and seductive, calling out, Jiang Lang, please come save me." Startled, he raised his candle, his heart hammering against his ribs as he searched for the source of the plea. There was no woman in sight, but before him sat a crystal coffin radiating a powerful spiritual energy. Realizing that fear wouldn't solve his problem, he stepped closer to the coffin, and what he saw inside left him utterly breathless. Lying within was an exquisitely beautiful woman dressed in a vibrant red wedding robe, her waist so slender it looked as though it could be held in one hand. Even lying down, her figure was undeniably striking, with lips as red as blood and a complexion like a sunset glow. Jiang Ping rubbed his eyes, convinced for a moment that her gaze had softened, sending him a silent, seductive plea. Then the voice returned, airy and delicate, begging him to wipe away the Buddhist seal and free her so they could be together. He felt himself losing control again as his hand reached toward the golden Buddhist seal on the crystal lid. Deep down, he fought with everything he had, certain that this woman was an omen of absolute disaster. It was obvious she was far too dangerous to provoke, and besides, this was Mount Qianhua, a sacred Buddhist ground. If a body was sealed here, releasing it would surely mean his death, and then he heard a sharp scratching sound. The sound of friction made his heart race. He silently promised never to be so reckless with spatial rifts again. Suddenly, his vision went black as he lost consciousness, and when he finally woke up, he was back in his own room. Liao Chen stood there with a worried expression, asking what had happened to him, which was a very good question. Hearing her voice brought him a strange sense of relief, and he cautiously asked her what had occurred. Liao Chen smiled, suggesting he was simply malnourished after staying in the library for over 2 hours without coming out. She explained that she had gone in to find him fainted, but assured him that some wild chicken soup would fix him right up. He cursed inwardly, knowing that if he were an ordinary man, her care would have been the end of him. Pushing his fears aside, he asked if anything else had happened, but Liao Chen only looked at him with genuine confusion. He remained silent, sniffing the soup to confirm it was indeed the pot he had brewed himself before daring to eat. He was truly starving, so he set his heavy thoughts aside and began to eat, while Liao Chen's smile grew wider. Perhaps because of his fainting spell, the old monk didn't summon him again, and Liao Chen stopped mentioning the secret techniques. Surprisingly, they simply let him stay there, though the amount of demon beast meat Liao Chen fed him increased daily. The next day, it was a 7th-tier iron-tailed eagle, pushing his power claw technique directly to the level of perfection. By the 3rd day, they were serving him 9th-tier iron-tailed eagles, which allowed him to acquire yet another powerful skill. Eagle Eye, an auxiliary ability and the secret to the eagle's hunting success, became his, while his own cultivation began to soar. He climbed from the 7th tier all the way to the 9th. After all, eating 3 eagles a day makes progress hard to avoid. However, Jiang Ping's heart grew heavier with every meal, as the sheer number of iron-tailed eagles he consumed felt ominous. We see a strange, restless atmosphere beginning to permeate the entire temple, visible even to the naked eye. Even Liao Chen's gaze had changed, and as he practiced his skills in his room that night, he sensed a growing danger. He knew that breaking through was his only way to stay safe, though he took comfort knowing this rift wouldn't exceed the spirit realm. At the 9th tier, he figured he could simply fight his way out if necessary. Meanwhile, in the old monk's room, the lights were dim. The candlelight flickered unsteadily as a raspy, hoarse voice asked why the boy hadn't undergone a demonic transformation yet. Liao Chen knelt on the floor, insisting to the abbot that she had personally watched him consume the demon beast carcasses. And yet, for some reason, he showed no signs of turning. The candle flared as the abbot declared it impossible. He demanded to know how anyone could resist the secret recipe of Mount Qianhua, accusing her of lying to him. Suddenly, Liao Chen was hoisted into the air by her neck, staring into a pair of eyes filled with pure, unadulterated rage. Desperate and gasping, she cried out that she would never dare deceive him, swearing she had seen the boy eat. The old abbot studied her closely before ordering her to prepare more ninth-tier iron-tailed eagles for the following day. He told her to take her junior brother and watch the boy personally, noting that those who haven't transformed cannot be saved. That was the rule of Mount Qianhua, and the rule of this place as well. Finally, Liao Chun was released. She wheezed, trembling with fear, and mentioned that the iron-tailed eagles had grown clever and were staying away from the mountain. She warned they could only provide them for 2 more days, but the abbot dismissed her concerns, calling the eagles mere beasts. He promised to handle the supply himself, and so, the iron-tailed eagles around Mount Qianhua were about to have a very bad week. For 10 consecutive days, the eagles were hunted nearly to extinction, making the old abbot increasingly irritable, a mood that quickly spread to everyone in the temple. The monks began to grow restless, their eyes following him with a hunger that suggested they wanted to devour him themselves. Jiang Ping simply smiled and greeted Liao Chun. After all, having consumed so many demon beasts over these past few days, he had finally reached a turning point. As he neared his breakthrough, his heart felt much lighter, knowing he had reached a level where he could no longer be easily defeated. No matter what the old abbot was planning, Jiang Ping felt ready to handle it, sensing he was approaching the absolute limit of this spatial rift. He could feel the boundary. Otherwise, his cultivation would have soared even higher. It was a classic case of a blessing in disguise. To be honest, having someone serve him high-level demon meat every day was pure bliss. But just as he was savoring the thought, the old abbot appeared. The abbot announced that he had brought a special addition to the menu today, presenting what he claimed were refined medicinal pills. He claimed these were pills he had personally crafted, brought specifically because the young guest appeared to be in a weakened state. Jiang Ping was stunned, though internally, he was laughing. Looking at the items, he realized exactly what they were. These weren't ordinary pills, they were concentrated medicine pellets. Keeping a straight face, he calmly thanked the abbot for his generosity. As he took the pellets, he realized he didn't actually need to consume them, since eating the demon meat already granted him all the skills he required. He figured he could just sell them later for a fortune, a practical thought for a boy who grew up poor, but the abbot's triangular eyes remained fixed on him. The abbot insisted that since he had refined these pills himself, he should be the one to guide the boy through the process of taking them. He demanded that Jiang Ping swallow them immediately to ensure the best medicinal effect. Yes, right there on the spot. Jiang Ping hesitated for a brief moment, realizing the old monk clearly had bad intentions, yet he didn't feel a shred of fear. He wondered if the game was simply leveling up. He had noticed the abbot was trying every trick in the book to get him corrupted. It seemed that as long as he remained unpolluted, the abbot couldn't lay a finger on him, so the old man was switching from meat to pills. But Jiang Ping wasn't afraid of consuming them. Those of the 13th city never feared such things, primarily because they relied on guidance techniques. These techniques were different from ordinary cultivation methods, serving as the very foundation of the 13th city's entire power system. The masters of the 13th city had developed methods to safely consume medicinal pills, even incorporating the refined blood essence distributed in schools. Jiang Ping smiled and thanked the abbot for his trouble, reaching out toward the box containing the mysterious medicinal pellets. He picked one that looked particularly appealing and prepared to swallow it, noting that this was actually his first time trying such a thing. He had often fantasized about the day he might finally afford a single pill. Now, his dream was being realized with an entire box. He swallowed the pill boldly while activating his guidance technique, all while the old abbot watched his every move with predatory intensity. As it went down, a flicker of joy crossed the abbot's face, sensing the very first traces of demonic corruption beginning to take hold. But just as quickly, those traces vanished into thin air. Jiang Ping savored the taste, wondering what unique benefits this pill would grant him. While others gained skills from demon meat, he was curious to see what a concentrated pill from a master alchemist could provide. The moment the pill touched his system, the ancient book in his mind began to flip its pages, revealing it to be an 8th heaven iron-tailed eagle. This adult demon beast pill contained a trace of the demon's bloodline and memories, suggesting it be paired with bitter camellia seeds for best effect. According to the book, such a combination would fully utilize the demon blood to significantly enhance the user's physical strength. The book's evaluation was blunt. The bloodline was so thin it was barely better than nothing, a critique that nearly made him laugh out loud. Still, he found the situation delightful. It turned out that consuming pills was just as effective for him as eating the meat had been. If he followed the book's specific recipes, he could even target specific body parts for reinforcement, like the eagle's claws, eyes, or wings. Since he was a human and lacked wings, he ignored that part, focusing instead on how the claws and eyes would translate to his own form. Essentially, by consuming the iron-tailed eagle pill, he could strengthen his hands and sharpen his vision far beyond that of a normal man. It would make his grip much more lethal, though he felt a slight pang of regret for not having the proper ingredients to maximize the effect. The old abbot stared at him in utter bewilderment, noticing that the boy actually looked disappointed, as if he wanted even more. The monk grew furious, realizing something was fundamentally wrong. He decided he had to take down this freak of nature no matter what. And who could blame him for being confused? A boy who eats that much demon meat and pills without a single sign of corruption is a freak indeed. Deep down, a spark of excitement ignited within the abbot as he wondered if he could study this boy to unlock such secrets from Mount Qianhua. Mount Qianhua had only survived this long without starving by relying on a single formula that merely delayed the inevitable demonic corruption. Looking at Jiang Ping, the old abbot felt as though he had discovered a priceless treasure. However, just as he prepared to make his move, a sudden sense of danger flared in his mind. Instead of fear, he felt a rush of adrenaline, as the warning only confirmed the boy's immense value. As evening fell, Jiang Ping felt he had stayed long enough and it was time to leave, yet he still hadn't figured out a way to escape. The path back down the mountain had long since vanished, leaving him to toss and turn in bed, unable to find a moment of rest. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence, followed by the voice of the monk Liao Chen calling out, "Benefactor, the abbot requests your presence." Jiang Ping's heart sank. He had sensed something wrong with the abbot's expression all day, and he knew this late-night summons wasn't for a friendly chat. He subtly shifted his right hand, feeling the raw power of his Grandmaster-level strength, which provided him a much-needed sense of security. His Grandmaster-level skill, Spirit Tranquility, was his ultimate trump card as he prepared to face whatever was waiting outside his door. But the moment he opened the door, a staff came crashing down toward his head in a vicious ambush. He immediately activated his power claw. He caught the staff with a single hand, holding it perfectly still, leaving Liao Chen paralyzed with shock as Jiang Ping smiled at him. He calmly asked what was going on, while Liao Chen's face turned a deep shade of red as his fellow monks began to swarm out from the shadows. Their faces were twisted with malice and their eyes were filled with a frantic, bloody thirst, the unmistakable scent of demonic corruption. Liao Chen laughed maniacally, ordering them to capture the boy alive so the abbot would reward them all with medicinal soup. Jiang Ping let out a cold snort, realizing they truly took him for an easy target, and his figure blurred as his fingertips turned a deadly white. With his power claw and spirit tranquility, dealing with these low-level monks was more than simple. It was, to be honest, barely a challenge. In just 30 seconds, the sounds of battle ceased abruptly, and Liao Chen's laughter turned into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Jiang Ping watched the blood drip from his nails, and noted with a slight smile that his unexpected strength was actually thanks to their own pills. Knowing that villains usually die because they talk too much, he drove his palm into the monk's head, leaving 5 holes as he looked out into the night. He spoke softly, asking if the abbot intended to show himself, just as a furious roar echoed through the night while he stood there calmly. Watching the old man approach, he noted with a smirk that anyone can hurl insults, but the abbot clearly lacked the courage to strike first. Otherwise, why send his disciples to die? Noticing their strange eyes, he realized this was the price they paid, as the abbot's own eyes turned red with rage. Jiang Ping laughed even louder, pointing out that since they both possessed spirit tranquility, perhaps a trade was in order instead of a fight. He offered to spare the old man's life in exchange for the way out, but the abbot only responded with a chilling, mocking laugh. The abbot called him naive, explaining that if he actually knew a way to leave this place, he wouldn't still be rotting here. He admitted he couldn't personally harm the boy since Jiang Ping hadn't been corrupted by demons yet, but he wouldn't let him leave either. With a wild laugh, the abbot declared that the boy would stay to keep him company until every one of his secrets was eventually unearthed. A wave of irritation hit Jiang Ping as he asked if there truly was no exit, only to learn the mountain's array allowed entry, but no escape. When he questioned where the beasts like the iron-tailed eagle came from, the abbot revealed he had been breeding them himself. Even the disciples were trapped. To survive, they had to eat demon beasts, which was a death sentence without a way to resist the corruption. The abbot, certain the boy was trapped, explained that his secret formula was the only thing delaying the inevitable madness. It was exactly as Jiang Ping suspected, though the reality was far darker, leading him to ask why the abbot wanted him alive at all. The abbot gave a twisted smile, explaining that the formula required the flesh of the youngest disciples to be brewed into a daily tonic. Mount Qianhua was named for 1,000 Buddhas, yet the abbot mockingly asked if the boy realized the true cost of that legacy. Jiang Ping felt his skin crawl as he realized that out of nearly 4,000 people, only these few remained. The abbot looked quite proud. His stomach churned at the realization that this wasn't a temple at all, but a living purgatory from which there was no escape. Staring at the abbot's arrogant face, Jiang Ping pointed out that with the disciples dead, there was no one left to turn into medicine. The abbot laughed until he cried, claiming he wasn't afraid to eat the beasts and was happy to wait and see who would die first. He noted that the corpses littering the ground would sustain him for over a decade, leaving Jiang Ping's fate entirely in question. As the abbot's eyes filled with a greedy hunger for his flesh, Jiang Ping simply asked if the old man truly had the stomach to try and eat him. He let out a dark, low chuckle that made the abbot's skin crawl, prompting the old man to nervously ask what could possibly be so funny. Walking to a corner, he tore down a curtain and set it ablaze. As the flames roared, he calmly asked how many days the abbot would last if all the corpses were burned. The abbot's rage boiled over as he let out a thunderous roar, screaming at the boy, demanding to know if he actually dared to do such a thing. With a slight tremble of his hand, Jiang Ping dropped the lighter, and we see the fire quickly spreading across the bedding and furniture. The abbot went mad, seeing his precious provisions going up in smoke, while Jiang Ping's face looked strangely soft and serene amidst the rising heat. But the old man only continued to howl in fury, asking the boy if he was seeking death, while Jiang Ping merely spread his hands wide. Looking entirely innocent, he told the old monk his hands had simply slipped. In response, the abbot lunged forward with a single, massive stride. His fingers turned pale, and his nails began to glow with a sharp light, revealing a perfected eagle claw technique that made Jiang Ping catch his breath. He wondered just how many pills one had to eat to reach this level, but Jiang Ping didn't flinch. After all, he was still the same resilient fighter he'd always been. As the old monk struck, Jiang Ping dodged the palm and shifted left, noting that while the old man was powerful, he was clearly lacking in speed. He managed to grab the abbot's arm, but the texture was sickeningly soft. When the skin peeled away in his hand, Jiang Ping nearly gagged at the sight. Underneath were countless pustules, looking like something out of a biological nightmare, while the abbot grinned with blood-stained teeth. The monk didn't understand the boy's words, but he explained that to give birth to demon beasts, one must first become a beast themselves. He boasted that this very hand had slaughtered countless iron-tailed eagles, telling Jiang Ping he was lucky to be its next victim, which, naturally, was a matter of opinion. Jiang Ping cursed the monk's idea of luck, just as the abbot chanted a Buddhist proverb about entering hell so that others might be saved. The abbot's arm transformed into a blur of razor-sharp claws, attacking with a fluid, relentless grace that left no room for escape. Jiang Ping was forced to block the eagle claws head-on, realizing that, fortunately, the old man only had one functional arm to use in this state. With a stylish slide, he evaded the old monk's frame, realizing in that moment that his suspicions about the old man's weakness were correct. The abbot was an unfinished product. As the old man lost his balance, Jiang Ping immediately pounced, delivering a heavy, crushing blow. Jiang Ping struck at the abbot's left leg, and as the bone snapped, the old man stared blankly, unable to believe his years of iron arm cultivation had failed him. His right leg followed shortly after, leaving him broken. Jiang Ping stood there with hands on his hips, feeling quite proud of his own cleverness in that moment. He taunted the old monk, asking where all that arrogance had gone, while the abbot remained lost in a daze, seemingly forgetting even the sensation of pain. Before the monk could finish a single word, his eyes closed forever as Jiang Ping's hand descended, leaving 5 bloody marks where he now stood over the body. Finally, he let out a long sigh of relief now that the old ghost was dead. Though he looked calm on the surface, his heart was actually racing like a drum. This was, after all, the very first time he had taken a life, and it was only after the adrenaline faded that he noticed something strange about the abbot's power. The old man's spiritual realm was incredibly lopsided. Throughout the entire fight, he hadn't used any chi, leaving Jiang Ping to wonder if the monk simply didn't know how. He decided not to overthink it as the temple burned around him, the flames lighting up the sky, though he felt a twinge of regret about the situation. We see him feeling a bit disappointed that he hadn't found any legendary treasures in this rift, unlike the stories where heroes stumble upon divine riches. He sighed, realizing he was perhaps being a bit greedy. If the abbot knew, he'd likely spit blood, considering the effort he'd spent hunting for the boy. The monk had hunted those iron-tailed eagles specifically to feed him and raise his spiritual level, yet here Jiang Ping was, still feeling it wasn't enough. He lightly blew on a few singed strands of his hair, and only after confirming his looks were still intact did he reluctantly turn to leave the burning ruins. He bid a silent, somewhat mournful farewell to the Thousand Buddha Mountain and the old monk, feeling a strange sense of melancholy despite everything. The world is a truly absurd place, he thought, as he finally located the glowing entrance of the rift and stepped through the light to make his exit. Suddenly, radio chatter filled the air as a rookie squad announced they had reached the designated location, repeating their status over the comms. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately dove into the tall grass as members of the city defense team arrived in their standard issue gear. The 13 cities certainly lived up to their reputation for speed, but the timing was off. This was clearly a time rift they were dealing with. According to the textbooks, time rifts are incredibly dangerous because no matter how long you stay inside, you return to the exact moment you left. 10 years of cultivation inside might only be a second outside. Such a rift could sell for 80 million, enough to change a person's social class forever. Great families often buy these to stabilize the space and accelerate time for their geniuses. And as he watched, Jiang Ping realized the stakes were rising. The more Jiang Ping thought about it, the more his heart ached. He had just missed out on a fortune, but he knew this prize was simply too big to swallow. We see him watching helplessly as the rookie squad approached the rift. 1 step, 2 steps, their feet lifting as they prepared to enter. Suddenly, the light of the rift vanished into thin air. He nearly cried out in shock as the group of high-level experts almost tumbled face-first into the dirt. The entire team was left in a state of complete confusion, and one female member turned to the captain, asking if they had actually gone inside or not. The captain was just as bewildered, though they knew the regulations by heart. This was the first time they had ever doubted their own senses. How could a rift simply disappear on its own, as if it were playing a game of hide-and-seek? To be honest, it defied everything they had been taught. Hidden in the tall grass, Jiang Ping was nearly dying of laughter, desperately covering his mouth to keep from making a sound at the sheer absurdity of it. He had been depressed about losing a billion-dollar opportunity, but seeing that no one else could have it either felt as refreshing as a cold popsicle in midsummer. It was perhaps a bit immoral to enjoy their failure, but he felt wonderful. A few minutes later, after the squad retreated, he finally crawled out of hiding. He dusted himself off and headed home, and that night, he slept more soundly than ever before. No matter how chaotic the world was, his home was a sanctuary. Ordinary people will never truly know that there are always those carrying heavy burdens in the darkness, protecting the peace of the morning. When dawn broke, he stretched his limbs, feeling refreshed, and heading straight for the incinerator room, where he still had some eighth heaven moon-howling dog meat. It was the perfect breakfast. He set up the pot, heated the oil, and began to eat until his stomach was perfectly round and full. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, telling himself that this was what life was truly meant to be: simple, full, and quiet. However, he didn't have much time for sentimentality. He quickly cleaned the dishes and restored the house to its original state, as his parents were returning soon. The week was up, and it was also time for him to return to school for his cultivation classes. In the past, he would have just slept through them. Things were different now. He couldn't afford a private tutor, but he was well known by everyone from the principal to the janitors, which had its perks. While washing up, he suddenly frowned, noticing something strange on his left wrist that hadn't been there before. There was a small red, almost like an embedded bead. It didn't hurt or itch, but he was certain it wasn't there yesterday. He wondered if it was a side effect of that mysterious book or perhaps a sign of some illness. After all, he had heard strange rumors about such things. He muttered to himself for a long while, but since the location of the dot didn't match any known illness, he simply gave up just as the door lock clicked. The sound of the latch turning signaled their arrival, and Jiang Ping rushed out immediately, shouting for his dear mother and father with genuine excitement. His mother, Yao Yujing, jokingly asked if his skin was itching for a beating, while his father, Jiang Wanli, looked at him with utter surprise. His father noted how energetic he looked. In the past, he never had enough to eat, so his complexion was naturally quite poor compared to now. Having stuffed himself with high-level meat lately, he was glowing with health, yet he worried they wouldn't accept such a sudden change. Yao Yujing sized him up suspiciously, and unable to withstand her gaze, our honest young man, who was a terrible liar, grabbed his bag and bolted. He shouted that he was heading to school because he had missed too many classes, leaving Jiang Wanli staring in shock at his wife. The father wondered if that was truly their son, since the boy had never cared about truancy before. Meanwhile, Jiang Ping took the long way to avoid Dongfang Land Street. As he reached the school gates and rubbed his eyes, a high-pitched, childish voice called out, accusing him of being a complete liar. The voice demanded to know where the promised books were, lamenting how difficult the last 7 days had been. Jiang Ping slapped his forehead in realization. He realized his reputation for honesty was about to be ruined. The little brother he had stood up was none other than the kid from the 3rd primary school. The books had long since been turned into recipes, leaving him in a bind, so he decided to pretend he hadn't heard and make it up after school. He hurried into the school, leaving the little youngster behind almost in tears, crying out for his brother Ping to just look at him. We see the child hopping and skipping to catch up, only to be stopped by a security guard who told him this wasn't a place for little kids. Sniffing back tears, the boy, Mi Lele, snapped that it was just a cultivator school and wasn't that big of a deal anyway. He declared he would enroll there sooner or later, and the guard, humoring him with a smile, said he believed in the young student. Mi Lele rolled his eyes, asking who the guard even was to offer his belief, but Jiang Ping's figure had already vanished from sight. The guard was left speechless while Jiang Ping hid around a corner, breathing a sigh of relief until a sudden hand tapped his shoulder. A voice teased that being chased to school by a primary student was quite a unique talent. Jiang Ping froze instantly and forced a wide grin. Showing all his teeth, he asked Lan Lan if she thought his teeth were changing again, claiming he had a toothache as she stood there in the breeze. Dressed in black training gear with her ponytail tied high, she was strikingly beautiful, her left hand gripping a blade with a sheath made of monster hide. Song Lanlan drew the blade halfway, asking Jiang Ping if he truly believed she wouldn't cut him, since it wouldn't be the first time. He had used her to trick someone out of golden blood. After all, he quickly pressed down on her wrist with an awkward laugh, blaming the other guy's gullibility. He argued that without a taste of society's cruelty, the fool wouldn't survive outside school. She tried to draw her sword again, but was suddenly startled. She noted his grip was stronger than hers today, wondering if she had skipped breakfast, and asked if he wasn't afraid she'd lose control of the blade. Before he could answer, a savior arrived as a roar erupted from behind them, commanding Jiang Ping to take his dog paws off Lamlin's hand. We see Jiang Ping turn around, nearly bursting into laughter at the sight of Li Zimu, before greeting his classmate with a cheeky, squint-eyed smile. He asked if the teachers hadn't taught him manners, which sent Li Zimu into a frenzy. The proudly family heir had been swindled out of his golden blood. To make matters worse, he had taken a literal beating from his sister and spent a week nursing his anger, hoping to reclaim his dignity the very next day. In his mind, Jiang Ping was just a talentless waste who couldn't cultivate. He had even fantasized about the boy kneeling and begging for mercy. But then, our protagonist took a leave of absence for 7 whole days. If not for his pride as a young master, Li Zimu would have hunted him down at home. He had barely managed to restrain himself until now, but seeing me holding his sweetheart's hand first thing in the morning was simply too much. Li Zimu roared for Jiang Ping to stop his little tricks so they could settle things one-on-one, just as a crowd of curious students began to gather. With the lazy king facing off against the genius young master, the onlookers felt this drama had enough potential for a 30-episode soap opera. The more people watched, the more confident Li Zimu became, certain of his victory. However, a cold, feminine voice suddenly cut through the air. Lan Lan asked Li Zimu exactly whose hand he was calling a dog paw, causing the surrounding crowd to erupt in a chorus of shocked whispers. The students marveled at senior Lan Lan losing her temper, mocking the young master for forgetting that while Lan Lan hits Jiang Ping, she does it with affection. It was a well-known fact that their bond was real. The last time some thugs bullied Jiang Ping outside school, Lan Lan had left them crawling on the floor. She had beaten them so badly they were likely still recovering. Meanwhile, Li Zimu stood there, his face contorted with a mix of rage and disbelief. He demanded to know why things were this way, yet looking at the girl before him, he was forced to suppress his rising anger for Lamlin's sake. Lan Lan told him to step aside, declaring this was between her and Jiang Ping, as she coldly pulled our protagonist behind her and drew her blade. She pointed the sword directly at Li Zimu, stating that Jiang Ping's business was her business, and if he wanted his surprise back, he should forget it. She told him not to dream of it, as it was his own lack of wits that was to blame. Li Zimu looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He couldn't believe his crush was defending a talentless waste, and with the blood rushing to his head, he let out a frustrated roar. He demanded to know why this was happening, turning to Jiang Ping to scream that if he were a real man, he wouldn't hide behind a woman. Jiang Ping simply laughed, as he didn't feel such a question deserved an explanation, and casually gestured for Xiao Huang to step in. He told Xiao Huang to explain things to the young master. The boy quickly finished his rap and stepped forward with a theatrical bow. Ignoring the crowd's boos, Xiao Huang smugly asked if Li Zimu was an outsider, since he clearly didn't understand the rules regarding certain men. When Li Zimu blurted out a demand to know what those rules were, Xiao Huang slowly explained that Brother Ping belonged to everyone here. He told him that they all had to protect him, and today, it didn't matter if he was a young master or had powerful connections behind him. He warned that in South City, touching Brother Ping was forbidden, and if anyone harmed a single hair on his head, Xiao Huang would lead the charge. He asked if Li Zimu believed the whole school would beat him. Suddenly, the young master was stunned as hundreds of students stepped forward. They lined up behind Lan Lan, some brandishing weapons and others grabbing whatever hard objects were at hand, forming a wall in front of Li Zimu. This massive display of solidarity sent Li Zimu stumbling back in fear, his mind racing with a single, repetitive thought: this shouldn't be possible. He wondered why they were all helping a talentless waste who couldn't even cultivate, especially since his own research had confirmed Jiang Ping was nothing. He turned his frustration toward Lan Lan, asking what was so wrong with him that she wouldn't choose him, before accusing them all of being blind. Xiao Huang laughed so hard he could barely stand, asking the young master exactly who had given him such outdated information. Li Zimu's eyes widened as he realized they were all in on it. He wasn't a fool, and he finally understood he had been played from the start. He had paid students for information, but if Jiang Ping was always being protected like this, how could an outsider ever learn the truth? Watching this scene, Jiang Ping felt a mix of pride and genuine emotion, but he knew he couldn't just stand there dazing forever. Jiang Ping knew it was time to end this spectacle, but just as he was about to step forward, a cold, ominous voice rang out through the morning air. The voice demanded to know why everyone was gathered there instead of being in class, shouting for Jiang Ping to get out. Xiao Huang was the first to bolt. The others followed suit, shouting apologies to Brother Ping, explaining that while they could block an enemy, they couldn't possibly stand against one of their own. The black-faced god had arrived, and the teenagers who were ready for a fight just moments ago scattered in an instant. While Li Zimu was still dazed, Jiang Ping grabbed Dongfang Lan's hand, asking her why she was daydreaming and telling her it was time to go. In the blink of an eye, only Li Zimu was left standing there alone as the black-faced god glared at him with pure fury. The teacher demanded to know if he and Jiang Ping were the ones responsible for this mess. Li Zimu briefly considered telling the truth. He wanted to blame Jiang Ping, but as the heir to the Li family, he realized that being a snitch would ruin his reputation forever. He kept his head down and remained silent, which, strangely enough, caused the black-faced god to look at him with a hint of newfound respect. The teacher promised not to punish him if he just named the culprits, but Li Zimu stayed silent, making the man even more satisfied with his character. For the crime of gathering a crowd to cause trouble, he was sentenced to 100 practice swings. Meanwhile, in the classroom, Dongfang Lan complained. She asked what the point of running was since the teacher would obviously know it was him, but Jiang Ping just shrugged, noting that being caught in the act is much worse. He admitted that the teacher definitely knew, but the consequences were different. She rubbed her wrist, staring at him with a suspicious look. She asked if his strength had increased, but he just played it off, suggesting he was simply well fed from the essence blood he had borrowed from her. He claimed he had eaten his fill, but she frowned, clearly not convinced. Meanwhile, at the nearby school building, Li Ziqing bowed slightly. She told the old principal that she was leaving Li Zimu's education in his hands, causing the old man to sigh deeply. He told Ziqing that she was actually the most suitable person to inherit the Li family, but she insisted that some things simply had to be done by someone. She refused to run away, leaving the principal in a long silence. He worried that such a heavy blow might be too much for the boy to handle. He noted that Jiang Ping was a top-tier whetstone, but wondered what would happen if the boy was actually crushed. Li Ziqing simply smiled. She suggested that if he broke, they could just have another child, leaving the principal speechless as Li Zimu began his laps on the field. 50 laps, and every single step felt like a knife to the bone, especially since the black-faced god was watching his every move. Whenever he slowed down, a glass marble would strike his leg. It was painful, but never broke the skin, a trick that supposedly earned the man his position. Up on the third floor, Xiaohuang leaned out the window and called for Jiang Ping to come look at the young masterly. We see Jiang Ping and Dongfang Lan exchange a look of genuine surprise. They fully expected to be dragged back to take the blame. Instead, Li Zimu was taking the fall all by himself, a sight that made Jiang Ping narrow his eyes in quiet contemplation. Dongfang Lan whispered that perhaps Li Zimu was a real man after all, just as Teacher Bai arrived to start the lesson. With a scarred face and a fierce aura, no one dared to cause trouble in his class, so Jiang Ping sat up straight and listened intently. Dongfang Lan glanced at him, noting how strange it was to see him actually paying attention for the first time since primary school. He waved her off, telling her not to disturb him, which annoyed her so much she poked him hard with her pen, making him yelp aloud. The entire class turned to look as Teacher Bai's gaze swept over them, immediately asking Jiang Ping to answer the question on the board. The teacher naturally ignored Dongfang Lan. In his mind, a well-behaved girl like her couldn't possibly be the instigator of such a disturbance. It was a classic case of prejudice, and Jiang Ping could only stare at the complex problem on the blackboard with a sense of mounting frustration. If he actually knew how to manipulate qi, he wouldn't have had to rely on pure physical strength during his old fights with the monk. Knowing that any explanation would be useless, he looked at the amused faces of his classmates and asked the teacher how he wanted to punish him. The class erupted in laughter, and even Teacher Bai's stern face twitched slightly at the boy's blunt honesty. Deciding the boy was almost too sincere for his own good, the teacher simply pointed toward the very back of the room. Jiang Ping understood the routine perfectly and scurried to the back, though this time, he made sure to bring his notebook and pen along. Teacher Bai resumed the lesson, having seen plenty of such interludes before, and reminded the students that this was a year of rapid development. He explained that most of them would soon attempt to break through their limits, a milestone that would determine their entry into the great academies. To spark their ambition, he decided to make an exception and lecture on the practical application of qi for those approaching a breakthrough. Teacher Bai wrote a complex formula on the blackboard and looked toward Dongfang Lan with an encouraging gaze, a signal the class understood instantly. It was clear that Dongfang Lan was on the verge of a breakthrough. Some felt envy while others were surprised, though no one found it strange for a genius. He explained that the application of qi is a spirit essence's most vital weapon. Without it, they are like children holding a blade, frightening, perhaps, but ultimately fragile. He began today's lesson with skill structures, focusing on how to channel qi during an attack, specifically the gale strike of the Tsungyuan wolf. Dongfang Lan listened as if in a trance. As she was currently refining at Tsungyuan wolf's inner core, Teacher Bai was clearly aware of her progress. Even those who couldn't fully grasp the theory found their horizons broadened by Teacher Bai's passion, while Dongfang Lan filled several pages with notes. Just as the lesson was nearing its end, Jiang Ping couldn't resist raising his hand, looking at Teacher Bai with an almost desperate hunger for knowledge. He asked how one might use the power claw of the iron-tail eagle, causing the entire class to turn around as Teacher Bai teased him for his sudden studiousness. The teacher remarked that such high-level techniques were far beyond him, suggesting he focus more on staying out of trouble instead. This was simply the way they interacted. Much like with a person with a disability, the more pity you show, the more uncomfortable they feel. True friends are those who drag you to a soccer game and make you play goalie, treating you neither as a victim nor as anyone particularly special. Because of this, no one avoided the topic of his inability to cultivate. They were all quite blunt about it as the students began to join in the teasing. They joked that Brother Ping should stick to studying how to get a full stomach, as the world of spirit essences was far too distant for him. With a chorus of laughs, they told him to stop joking around, claiming they weren't used to him acting like a scholar when they had all agreed to be slackers. They accused him of betraying the group, and in the past, he might have joined the joke, but now he simply didn't have the time for it. He told them all to get lost with a huff of annoyance, insisting that he was trying to have a serious discussion with Teacher Bai about the problem. That claim of being serious only made the class laugh harder. Xiao Huang even clutched his stomach and pounded on his desk in hysterics. Giving a sarcastic thumbs up, Xiao Huang told him that he really was the funniest guy around, which only served to make Jiang Ping feel more frustrated. These kids truly looked down on him. After being unable to cultivate for so long, he naturally felt the sting of their words and the desire to prove them wrong. He knew that mere words were useless and that it was better to let facts speak for themselves, so he decided it was time to take action. His hand suddenly shot out toward the back blackboard, executing a Grandmaster-level move as his 5 fingers swept across the surface with a faint glow. Red light flowed for an instant, and 5 deep holes were carved into the board. The entire class fell silent, as if time itself had stopped. Dongfang Lan covered her mouth in shock. Xiao Huang's eyes widened, and Teacher Bai stood frozen in place after witnessing that display. That imposing aura and the red spirit chi made the teacher's heart scream in disbelief. At that moment, Jiang Ping had made his point. It was clear to everyone that Jiang Ping had finally awakened his spirit chi. Seeing their shock, a slight smirk played on his lips. He put his hands behind his back and scanned the room, remarking that the board was too fragile and jokingly asking who would offer their head for practice. His dramatic flair was off the charts, but Dongfang Lan's eyes filled with tears of joy as she realized that Ping could finally cultivate. Xiao Huang and the others reacted instantly, rushing over like madmen to embrace him while shouting that Brother Ping had actually done it. The entire class erupted, completely forgetting they were in the middle of a lesson as they swarmed around him in a frenzy. They cheered that heaven hadn't forsaken him, celebrating the fact that their friend could finally join the world of cultivation. They surrounded him, looking even happier than if they had achieved a breakthrough themselves. Yet as they tossed him into the air, he felt strangely empty. He wondered if they shouldn't have doubted him first, allowing him to crush them in a duel before making a grand, glorious return. This overwhelming warmth was actually making him a bit uncomfortable, especially when someone suddenly ran into the hallway to scream the news. The student roared for everyone to come and see that Brother Ping could cultivate, and in an instant, the entire floor was shaken by the news. Heads popped out from every classroom as the word spread like wildfire that Jiang Ping had finally awakened his powers. It was total chaos. Countless people gathered outside the classroom to watch him being tossed up and down like a local celebrity. Even the other teachers joined the crowd. He had wanted to redeem his pride, but instead, he had become the center of a public spectacle. Looking at the sea of faces staring at him like a monkey in a zoo, he could only cover his face as he went up and down. Finally, Teacher Bai spoke up, asking what everyone was looking at and telling them to get back to their own classes since the period wasn't over. He jokingly scolded Teacher Li for letting his students run into their room, while the other students were left startled by the sudden authority. The students snapped to attention with a loud thud, but there was one small problem. Jiang Ping was still midair when they let go. He felt like crying. His grand moment of showing off had somehow devolved into a circus act, much to his silent frustration. Dongfang Lan hurried over to help him up, her eyes shimmering with tears as she asked when he had finally recovered. With every eye in the room fixed on him, he steadied himself and began a tale about a dark and stormy night. He claimed an old man appeared, calling him a once-in-a-millennium genius, a story that earned him a collective look of pure disbelief. Teacher Bai tapped the blackboard, ordering the intruders back to their own classes, and slowly, the crowd began to disperse. He breathed a sigh of relief, but then Teacher Bai turned to him, telling Ping to follow along while the others studied. The teacher threatened to work anyone to death who dared to speak, leaving the entire class in a state of chilled silence. Jiang Ping knew he couldn't hide the truth forever. If he wanted resources and a place in the academy, he had to be open. He had to live up to his reputation, so they walked in silence until Teacher Bai smiled and led him toward the principal's office. The teacher clearly didn't buy the just got better excuse. They knocked and entered to find the white-haired principal reading war reports. The principal glared, asking if he was in trouble again, but Teacher Bai cut in to announce that Jiang Ping could finally cultivate. The teacher admitted the situation was beyond his grasp, prompting the principal to stand so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. In total shock, the principal demanded an explanation, his heavy gaze falling directly on the young man standing before him. He noted that Ping seemed fine just last week, questioning where this sudden surge of spirit blood and power had come from. Jiang Ping simply shrugged, unable to tell the truth, that eating monster meat made him stronger, knowing no one would believe him anyway. He realized that an unexplainable miracle was often more dangerous than a disability, as the principal thoughtfully picked up the phone. With a grave tone, the principal asked the person on the other end where that last batch of monster spirit blood had originated. The call was to his son in the special ops team, who sounded quite confused by his father's sudden and urgent inquiry. The old principal hung up and suddenly burst into laughter, pointing at Jiang Ping and calling him a lucky little rascal. The principal explained that the spirit blood had been a gift from his son in the special ops department, never imagining it would end up with Ping. He had only just learned it was the blood of a beast king. Had he known its true value, things might have gone differently. The old man admitted he never would have given it away, while Jiang Ping stared back, realizing his own fabricated lie was becoming reality. To be honest, Ping knew his tongue was experienced enough to tell that the blood he drank had nothing special about it at all. Teacher Bai was equally stunned, questioning why the principal would ever give something as precious as Beast King blood to this boy. The old principal waved it off with a shrug, noting that no one could have guessed its origin at the time. He blamed his son for not being clear, as it was meant for his own health, but now the boy had reaped the benefits. Turning to the teacher, he praised little Bai for his handling of the situation, now that the mystery seemed to be solved. He told them to head back to class, but not before insisting that Ping pay for the 5 holes he punched in the blackboard. Ping stared at him in disbelief, pleading that a school this wealthy shouldn't be sweating the small stuff, especially since it was an accident. He argued that he only did it because no one believed him, but the old principal just snorted at the excuse. The principal joked that everyone knew Brother Ping too well, which was exactly why he had earned a certain reputation. He reminded Ping of his title as the shame of Nanqing's education circle, a remark that left the boy completely speechless. Since he had literally eaten the man's gift, Ping couldn't really argue, so he quietly followed Teacher Bai out of the office. He whispered a hope that the teacher wouldn't be petty about the money, but Teacher Bai only gave a mysterious, knowing smirk. They headed toward the training room, so the teacher could see if this Beast King miracle was truly as magical as it sounded. High-ranking Beast King blood almost never reached ordinary cultivators, yet here was a boy who had supposedly transformed overnight. Teacher Bai couldn't help but lick his lips, wondering if he should call some old comrades to hunt a Beast King of their own. He touched the scar near his eye as they walked away, and back in the office, the principal's smile instantly vanished. He picked up a secure line, identifying himself as Mo Zhengqi, and ordered his contact to lock down all information regarding their location. The person on the other end was stunned to hear that a mere student's file now required A-level clearance to be accessed. "Teacher, please don't joke around," the voice pleaded. "You're asking me to make a massive mistake here." The old principal, Mo Zhengqi, roared back, asking if the man had forgotten all the messes he'd cleaned up for him in the past. He asked if the man would even be where he was today without that help, mocking his sudden desire to play by the rules. The man finally gave in, admitting defeat and asking the old principal exactly how he wanted this handled. He declared that if it came down to it, he'd just quit his job and head to the front lines instead. The principal finally smiled, noting that this was the right attitude as the A-level clearance was officially activated. We see that the issue lay in Ping's elementary files, which labeled him with his spirit-severed constitution that blocked all energy. It meant he should have been unable to cultivate for life, though such individuals were known to possess brilliant minds. In fact, the entire modern guidance system was created by such a person, a literal god among men, which explained the principal's favoritism. A moment later, the contact called back to confirm the task was done, though he sounded completely exhausted by the ordeal. He threatened to jump off a building if he was ever asked to do this again, but the principal simply hung up on him. The old man muttered that if he wouldn't do it, plenty of other former students would. Then, the phone rang again. It was his son in his black uniform, looking utterly confused as he asked what on earth this Beast King blood story was about. The principal barked at him to just come home when he had time and hung up. The old man was clearly losing his patience. We moved to the combat training room, where Teacher Bai watched as Ping excitedly swung his arms around. The traces of blood on his fingers glowed like golden veins, striking a testing stone 10 meters away with a dull thud. Ping asked if this was what externalizing energy felt like, while Teacher Bai stood there with his jaw on the floor. The boy had gone from not knowing how to use energy to launching long-range attacks with a power level of 2000. That was 3 times higher than a typical spirit entry rank, prompting Ping to ask if he was a natural-born genius. Teacher Bai's mouth twitched as he wondered how long it had taken Ping to master this trick. He really felt like slapping him. But to maintain his image as a wise mentor, he cleared his throat and told Jiang Ping that while his speed was decent for his age, he was still a bit behind compared to a real master, or even the principal's son, who had apparently taught himself. Ping's eyes widened, and he took the bait, promising to work harder. Then he mentioned reading that energy colors relate to attributes. He noted that yellow usually means earth and red means fire, leading him to wonder if his own power was fire-based. Teacher Bai rubbed his face in frustration, retorting that this wasn't fire at all, it was a deep blood red. He pointed out that it had absolutely nothing to do with fire, leaving Ping in a thoughtful silence about what his power actually was. Ping joked that it couldn't be a blood attribute just because he'd consumed so much golden blood, especially since textbooks never mentioned it. Teacher Bai admitted he didn't understand it either, suggesting someone at the academy might know. We see they spent half the day training. By the end, Ping had mastered the spirit mirror guidance and the power claw, manifesting blood-colored claws that looked like battle armor. They could be used for melee or as projectiles, though Ping couldn't help but feel the technique looked a bit sinister. He didn't dwell on it, and he certainly didn't mention the moon vanishing dog's abilities, as explaining their origin would be impossible. He felt confident that once he mastered the Iron-tail Eagle's claw, he could figure out the rest of his powers later. Feeling his stomach growl, he said goodbye to Teacher Bai and returned to his class, where he was immediately swarmed with questions. Annoyed by the chatter, he threatened to jump off the building if they didn't stop. Meanwhile, outside, a sweaty Li Zimu watched him. Zimu stared intensely, convinced that Jiang Ping had been playing the pig to eat the tiger all along. He told himself that a spirit mirror was nothing, vowing to catch up in 20 days and finally defeat his rival. He felt a mix of frustration and excitement, thinking that Ping would have no more excuses to refuse a duel once he was stronger. He believed that a fair victory would restore everything. After school, Ping hurried away to avoid any more interrogation. He still had an errand to run, getting those picture books for his little brothers at the primary school, so he headed out as darkness fell. It was nearly 8 o'clock by the time he headed home. In the past, he wouldn't have dared to stay out so late, but now, with his spirit mirror, he felt much bolder. As he swung his backpack on, he suddenly slapped his forehead, realizing that with his new cultivation, he could simply channel energy into his feet. He figured that scaling a small wall would be effortless now, so he spat on his palms and rubbed them together with a determined grin. With energy swirling around his legs, he felt a surge of excitement. It was actually working, and he prepared to launch himself upward. He shot off the ground like a cannonball and landed steadily inside the courtyard wall. It was a success, and he found this new power quite entertaining. He began tiptoeing toward his room, but the sound of Yao Yujing coughing stopped him in his tracks as she asked her good son where he thought he was going. He looked up to see his mother looking kind as ever, though her eyes were red, making it clear she had been crying recently. When he awkwardly asked if she had eaten, Yujing managed a tearful laugh, unable to hold back her emotions while looking at her sensible son. She asked if he was truly cured, and Ping, pretending to be casual, confirmed that he was, and asked if the principal had already told her. She gave him a light smack, calling him a brat for not telling them sooner. If the old principal hadn't called, she wondered how long he would have kept it a secret. He gave a sheepish laugh, explaining that he was just afraid of it being a false alarm, but now everything was finally going to be okay. He told her the family wouldn't have to struggle so much anymore, then mentioned he'd passed a cosmetics shop and bought her the latest cream to try. As he pulled the small bottle from his bag, Yujing felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to cry, but she held it back for his sake. To be honest, her son was almost too thoughtful, even if he was a bit of a troublemaker when it came to spending his money. While mother and son chatted in the courtyard, his father, Jiang Wanli, smoked in silence, listening to the unusually joyful atmosphere now that Ping was healthy. They could finally live like a normal family, though Wanli suddenly glanced toward the crematorium with a slight, troubled frown. He cautiously asked Ping what his plans were now that he was better, speaking carefully, as if afraid of touching a sore spot. Ping understood immediately. His father was thinking about their family's unique status as descendants of the crematorium director. In this harmonious society, the college entrance exams were complicated for people with their background due to certain long-standing traditions. There was an unwritten rule that once you took the job, you had to serve for 3 generations, as few people willingly chose such a soul-draining profession. The work carried a constant risk of spiritual pollution, making it a job people both loved and hated. Loved for the steady income, but hated for the limitations it imposed. It cast a long shadow over future generations, and in his excitement, Wanli had momentarily forgotten that his son's future was tied to this grim legacy. While everyone was busy dreaming of a bright future, they had subconsciously ignored their social standing, until Ping asked his father exactly what he meant. Wanli hesitated, suggesting he could keep working while pulling strings to get Ping into an academy, bypassing the normal entrance exams if necessary. Not wanting his father to worry, Ping flashed a wide, 8-toothed grin and said he didn't mind either way, though Yao Yujing felt a pang of guilt. She felt it was unfair that after finally recovering, her son still couldn't attend school normally. She blamed their own circumstances for holding him back. She suggested they ask the old principal for advice, and Wanli's eyes lit up as he realized that was a brilliant idea, immediately reaching for the phone. However, as soon as he explained the situation, the old principal began scolding him over the line, calling Wanli a complete brat for his narrow thinking. The principal shouted that he should have beaten some sense into Wanli years ago, saying it was one thing for the father to be aimless, but quite another to ruin Ping. He told Wanli not to even think about dragging Ping down, reminding him that working at the crematorium was still a vital service to the 13 cities. He dismissed the unwritten rules as mere talk that no one dared enforce openly, telling Wanli that he didn't need to worry about such nonsense. The principal insisted he had his own plans for the boy, then called Wanli a scoundrel and demanded to speak with Yujing instead. Having heard her husband getting torn apart over the phone, Yujing nervously took the receiver, her head hanging low in anticipation of the lecture. She timidly asked if her teacher was doing well, looking for all the world like a primary school student who had just been caught misbehaving. Ping couldn't help but stifle a laugh at the sight, while the principal's tone softened significantly as he joked that he hadn't been annoyed to death just yet. He told her not to worry about Ping's future, explaining that he had already arranged something through her senior fellow student. The plan was for the boy to join the army at the front lines, eventually earning a military recommendation to the academy, a solid, respectable path. He promised that as long as he was around, Ping's future wouldn't be wasted, and he would have a word with her senior sister to finalize the details. Yujing was moved to tears, but the principal gave a gruff snort, telling her to stop crying because he couldn't stand seeing people get emotional in their old age. She did as she was told, keeping the tears in her eyes without letting them fall, and they continued their long conversation until everything was settled. As the call ended, the family shared a warm smile, and Yujing gently stroked Ping's head, reminding him that a person must always live with a clear conscience. She told him his life was a gift from the people of Nanchung, and that no matter what happened, he must always do his best to remember that debt. Ping gave a firm nod of agreement, and seeing that the boy was finally well, the three of them sat down for a rare, celebratory feast. Wanli even let him have a little wine, and they didn't head to bed until 10 that night. From this day forward, the house finally felt alive again. Ping lay in bed feeling a bit lightheaded, and though he hadn't eaten any monster meat that day, he strangely didn't feel the usual gnawing hunger. He figured he had eaten so much lately that missing a single meal didn't matter, much like how people in a stable society can skip a meal without issue. However, a new problem weighed on his mind. He would eventually need to find a secret base to continue his cultivation. He realized he'd have to find a way to quietly siphon off some monster remains while working at home, or he'd never be able to satisfy his appetite. With these messy thoughts swirling in his head, he drifted off to sleep, and in his dreams, he found himself back at the Thousand Buddha Mountain Temple. Everything there had collapsed except for the library, which still stood tall. As he wandered through the dream, he was struck by how vivid it all felt. It seemed the dream was evolving on its own, perhaps a case of dreaming at night what one thinks of by day, so he decided to explore a bit. He wanted to finish reading the strange tales he had started before the old monk had dragged him away, a lingering regret he hoped to settle here. He made his way to the same spot as before, but the moment he opened the book, that same peculiar sound echoed through the air. A small smile played on his lips as he noted how realistic the dream was, even including the strange noises from his previous visit. Last time, he had discovered a cave and a stunningly beautiful woman, and he hadn't expected the dream to recreate that detail as well. With a bit of a chuckle, he set the book down and followed the familiar path through the cave until he reached the bottom chamber once more. There stood the crystal coffin, looking exactly as it had at Thousand Buddha Mountain, and the woman was still inside, just as he remembered. However, the seal on her forehead was gone, leaving only a breathtaking woman in a red bridal gown lying quietly within the crystal. For a second, he thought he saw the corners of her mouth twitch upward, which gave him a start before he remembered where he was. He told himself he wouldn't be frightened in his own dream, and with a surge of boldness, he walked right up and crouched down beside her. He leaned in to observe her closely, amazed by how real it felt. Even the fine hairs on her skin were visible. Dreams these days were getting impressively vivid. Deeply shaken by the realism, he moved even closer, unable to help but marvel at the sheer wonder of creation. He wondered how such a beautiful woman could exist, with every feature seemingly perfect. It was truly breathtaking. But then, just as he tried to look closer, his vision suddenly went black. When he finally came to, he was jolted awake by a familiar, gnawing hunger. He stared blankly at the ceiling, wondering why his dream had ended so abruptly. Glancing at the clock, he saw it was already 7 in the morning. He cursed his luck. He had wanted to see what happened next in that dream. Rubbing his stomach, he noticed the furnace was already being lit. Realizing Wanli was already up and working, he quickly dressed and hurried into the incineration room to help. He told his father to take a break and let him handle the work. You see, he had a plan to quietly set aside some meat to cook later. He just wasn't sure what kind of monster they were processing today. Wanli looked at his sensible son, feeling a sense of pride in how much he'd grown. The older man didn't push himself. He told Ping that since he knew the process, he would head out to buy some breakfast. He handed Ping the professional deboning knife and asked, almost as an afterthought, if his son still needed to drink the essence blood. Ping reassured him that he didn't. He suggested they collect the blood instead, as a full bottle could actually be sold for a decent price. Wanli laughed, agreeing that it was a practical idea, and then headed out. Left alone, Ping turned his attention to the carcass before him. After a quick inspection, he felt a twinge of disappointment. It was another iron-tailed eagle. These things were apparently quite common lately. With his stomach growling, he knew he had to move fast. He started by extracting the essence blood, making sure no one was watching. He quickly skinned and quartered the beast, keeping his gloves on since his parents were home. He carved out the tenderest cut and wrapped it in oilcloth. As he hid the meat, he suddenly remembered the rift from that night. He couldn't help but think how convenient it would be to have a time rift of his own. If he had one, he wouldn't have to sneak around hiding meat. He'd even have a private place to cook it. Just thinking of the space at Thousand Buddha Mountain made him envious. But then, his vision suddenly went dark again. He panicked for a moment, wondering what was happening, and more importantly, where his meat had gone. The large portion of meat he had just carved was simply gone. He searched frantically under the table and on the floor, but there was no sign of it. As he crouched down, drenched in a cold sweat, he noticed the teardrop mole on his wrist twitch, and his heart skipped a beat. he realized that mole looked exactly like the one on the woman in the crystal coffin. It was an uncanny resemblance. If he hadn't dreamt of her last night, he might not have noticed that the woman's face seemed to be missing its mole now. We should mention that Ping was obsessed with stories about cultivators, tales of chance encounters, secret realms, and time rifts. One story told of a man who stumbled into a secret realm a decade ago, gaining the power to control time rifts. That man became a legend before his fall, though many called the story a fake. But what if it wasn't? He wondered if he was one of the lucky ones. To test it, he cut another piece of meat and stared at the mole. The meat vanished instantly. He clapped a hand over his mouth to keep from screaming. He was about to be very, very rich. He had just been wishing for a time rift, and now, here it was. He closed his eyes, touched the mole, and vanished. When he opened his eyes, he was back at Thousand Buddha Mountain, standing among the ruins where the library still stood. A sudden pang of regret hit him so hard, he could barely breathe. He actually slapped himself twice in frustration. Had he known this place would become his property, he never would have burned it down just to spite an old monk. It hadn't been his home back then, but it was now. The satisfaction he felt during the fire had turned into pure agony. He wanted to cry, realizing all these buildings were technically his. With a heavy sigh, he tried to calm his racing heart. He told himself that what is meant to be will be, and if he had to, he would simply rebuild everything from scratch. His heart throbbed in sync with the twitching mole. Looking at the library, he felt a strange, inexplicable sense of dread. Last night's dream had been far too vivid. If it hadn't happened, he never would have discovered the secret of the mole. That meant it likely wasn't a dream at all. He wondered why that woman had called him Jiang Lang, a truly bizarre name. Unable to figure it out, he decided it was best to stay away from the library for now. He only needed a place to cook. He reminded himself to be content and avoid being greedy. With that thought, he turned and walked toward the ruins. After searching for quite some time, Ping found an intact room and headed to the kitchen to gather pots and pans. As he began building a stove, he felt a prickling sensation on his back, as if someone were watching him. He turned to find a Buddha statue staring. Thousand Buddha Mountain was in ruins, yet this stone figure remained vigilant. Annoyed, he struck out with 5 bloodlines, toppling the statue until he finally felt at ease in the silence. Before long, the stove was ready, and he tossed the iron-tailed eagle meat inside to begin a slow, savory stew. He wondered why no monsters had appeared yet, but being far too hungry to investigate, he focused on his cooking. After a hearty meal, a wave of comfort washed over him, and he noticed his sharp claw technique felt significantly stronger. With his wrist movements becoming steadier and more precise, he realized he had to make the most of this secret land. The problem was how to smuggle more monster carcasses inside. With a single thought, he willed himself back to the incinerator. Checking the clock, it was 7:50. He remembered entering at 7:30, meaning time moved differently in that realm. An hour inside was only 20 minutes outside, a 1:3 ratio, so he decided not to hide the remaining eagle carcass. He tossed it into the furnace, spending the next few days obsessing over how to acquire a larger supply of monsters. He was growing tired of eagle meat, but his internal energy was rising, slowly increasing from 1 gram to 3. Reaching 9 grams would bring him to the peak, where mastering a single skill would allow him to break through. This is the Great Divide, where the gap between common children and those of great clans truly begins to widen. A life bond skill is etched into one's very bones, staying with a cultivator for the rest of their natural life. Wealthy heirs use high-grade monster cores to forge broken but highly compatible skill frameworks for their future success. The larger the operating memory of these frameworks, the higher their achievements. Ordinary people, however, must rely on luck. The 13 cities mandate that high schoolers cannot break through early, as the government takes the best cores first. Only the leftovers reach the market. To get anything better, one must endure the academy, which is never free. One must either contribute or show immense talent, as there is no such thing as a free lunch, even when it comes to knowledge. Ping had spent the last few days studying intensely, finally understanding why the old principal insisted on the academy. Outside, resources were simply non-existent. Without those resources, even the greatest talent is wasted. The best opportunities are locked within the academies or the military, though the latter is nearly impossible to enter. Clearing his mind, he pondered the temporal rift he had discovered, deciding to name it the heaven-swallowing secret realm. A 1-to-3 time ratio offered incredible possibilities, and he reminded himself that he wasn't like ordinary people who had to practice for years. He didn't need to spend decades mastering skills. He could simply eat, gaining internal energy and strength as long as he had enough monster carcasses. His eyes lit up as he suddenly realized another potential use for the heaven-swallowing secret realm, one that was far more ambitious. He chuckled to himself, thinking that if this idea actually worked, life would become very interesting indeed. But while Ping was feeling quite pleased, the old principal was feeling anything but happy as he shouted into his phone. Jiuanxiu, if you can't even handle this small matter, what good are you? That boy is not just my grand disciple. He is your junior sister's child. Why is it that everyone else gets to take the easy path, strolling through for a bit of prestige before the academy exams, while our child has to face the real, dangerous deal?